The topic I'll be presenting today is caste economics, inequity, and climate justice in India. So, what I'll be covering in this during presentation is I'll be giving background of my research paper, which after that I will be talking about the relation of caste economic inequity in India, the like impact of climate change on various castes, and how and the case study, that is methodology, how and why there is a relation between caste and climate resilience, and conclusion. We also talks about outcome as well as recommendations uh, for the further research and work on climate justice in India. So before presenting my paper, I would like to like establish my positionality for this paper. And before the theme of my, or the backbone of my positionality would be this quote. Like this phrase would fit the best. It is a quote of Dr. Ambedkar. It says, "Turn in any direction you like. Caste is a monster that crosses your path." So saying this, the framework that I have used to write the paper and present my recommendations and my conclusion was based on Ambedkarite feminist perspective, which includes human rights, caste, gender, and sustainable development. So when I say this, at international forum of research and frameworks, Ambedkar stands for sustainable development and uh, democratic ideas and like and development of the society. So um, background, like as the audience are mostly from India, so they know how caste is a structure unequal social hierarchy um, embedded in our society. And why I want to say this, why I would like to use this statement, because caste is the access of all kinds of privileges, social capital, development, sustainable development, and all kinds of exclusion, inclusion, and um, discrimination in the society, in Indian societies, like per se. And when we say how caste impacts social, political, economic, and other kind of development, uh, for this purpose of the paper, I have delimited my um, uh, collaboration, or I have delimited my relation of caste to economic only, because I'll be discussing about economic inequity and impact of caste and climate justice. So the economic structure in India are diverse these days, but say more than 70% of the population in India stays in rural sector. So still in rural sector, about 60 to 65% of the people or population is dependent on agriculture sector. So for that, land becomes the primary source of livelihood and also a means of production and culture and social status. So and like saying that the literature on economic in India, economics in India has proven or discussed several times that land has been not only the mean of livelihood or social status, it also has been a capital for establishing or re-establishing the unequal structure of caste, because of the unequal distribution of land among the caste groups, which I'm discussing in future. And when I'm saying that, like how climate change is impacting the marginalized caste or the oppressed caste, or um, in other terms, lower caste in India. Um, the argument of this paper is climate change is widening the existing economic inequities among the caste groups in India. And how it is impacting, I have discussed through a case study, and which I'll be reading out that case study to you all, because that is the reason I asked how much time I'm like provided to present this. So that is a interesting. I feel that is a interesting data to discuss. So I'll be going in details in that in future in my presentation. So caste and land holdings. Just to give snapshot, this is the recent agriculture census of India, which was conducted in 2015-16, which clearly shows that the most of the land um, like that is nearly 80% is been governed by the other caste, whose population or like proportionally they are around um, 15 to 20%. Um, they actually have the access of 80%, and the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe and even the institutions of in India have disproportionately lesser land holding, like when we compare it to their population or their um, um, power or their existence in the country. And when I'm saying this exists in the country, I want to bring focus of everyone audience on the institutional this thing of land holding. So institution, that is government, has only 0.18% land holding status of that in there. And why I'm saying this, because in recommendations I'll be discussing specifically on this. And these are the relation of like caste and other uh, means of productions or other assets, and which also like you can see that they are unequal. So you can see that the population of Dalits of scheduled caste as per the census of 2011 is around 18 to 90%, but the total assets of there are 7.4. The other backward caste, their population is around 54%, but their assets are 31%. And dominant caste, whose population is around 15%, their um, total assets are 45%. And rest is, that is other minorities, tribals and other things, their population around 10%, 10% plus other 4 to 5%, but they have their um, total assets because of land, they are nearly to their population. So now coming to climate change in India, the recent um, meeting or the report on impact of climate change in India, March 2019, they have their, the quote which I extracted from their report is, the impact of climate change will not be borne equally or fairly. That means it will be unequal based on the social capital or climate resilience of the population, based on their resources or based on their power relation with everyone in the society. And in India is an agrarian society, like, so when I'm saying this, India is agrarian society, uh, it means that India's most of the like economy or like GDP or everything will be dependent on monsoons or rain or everything that is agriculture sector, or even everything, even industry, even like even communication, even traveling, everything is dependent on the rainfall which they get. And because of the climate change, there is a change in monsoons, there is change in cycle, there is change in like the drought region in my region has like gone much more longer. The drought earlier used to be of 2 to 3 months, but now it has been extended to 5 to 6 months. The rainfall is so untimely, so the crops are like, means it is disproportionately impacting the aggregate sector in the rural sector of India, as well as the population which is dependent on that. And why, when I'm saying that, I would like to bring one thing in to picture, that it has influenced disproportional migration to the urban regions, and again it is creating unhygienic, unhealthy, and um, uh, like ghettos in the cities, and which is also impacting the resources which the, for example, the urban areas where had our capacity of catering certain number of population, but because of the migration, the overbulging of the population in the cities also is impacting the equilibrium of that urban sector as well as the environment at that area. And apart from only agriculture sector, it has also impacted the allied sectors like livestock and fishery, which I'll not be discussing much in this because my data during my research was not focusing on fishery and livestock. So the relation of caste and um, climate justice. When I'm saying this, I would like to uh, discuss this briefly with the case study which I presented in my research paper. So um, before I'm just figuring, yeah. So it is a case study which is actually been conducted in the time span of 7 months. So I'll be discussing I'll be discussing the methodology in future, but I first of all I'll present that in front of you. So caste still plays a very important role in all aspects of Indian society, especially in economy. The consequences of historical injustice to oppressed caste due to the caste system is evident by inequities existing in all spheres of life. Climate change adds further burden for those most marginalized. By examining the relation of caste and climate resilience, this section discusses the convergence of caste, climate change, and caste system in widening caste-based economic inequity. This is substantial. There is substantial literature on the impact of climate change in India. However, it does not consider the effect of climate change intersection with caste inequities. Climate change has been examined in terms of its impact on agriculture production and environment, the economy of the nation, migration of farmers and laborers, and safety and vulnerability of women, children. The disproportionate impact of climate change on various castes has not yet been examined comprehensively, especially the economic dimension of such intersection. The relation of caste, climate resilience, and depending economic inequities can be explored further through the following illustration drawn from a personal account of my um, maternal village. This illustration demonstrates the intersectionality of caste, class, and gender, which is intertwined with climate justice, climate change risks on many fronts. It also illustrates the story of millions of landless Dalits household who depends on caste economy in villages for their survival. The village of Sonavala is situated in the eastern region of state of Maharashtra in India. It is part of Marathwada region, which is one of the economically struggling region of Maharashtra. It lacks natural resources. The annual average rainfall in the region is below of the rest of the country, and the drought is permanent feature of the region. The main occupation of people in this region is agriculture, which is dependent on rainfall. Another important aspect of the agriculture sector in this region is the strong presence of marginalized and small scale farmers. The region also contributes to one of the highest suicide rates among farmers in the country. Sonora village has been facing drought for last 5 years. Like most villages in India, this village has highest population of non-Dalit dominant caste as compared to Dalits. The land ownership is also dominated by non-Dalits, with only a couple of households having marginalized lands for agriculture. Livelihood of most of the Dalit households in this village predominantly comes from agriculture or manual labor and seasonal migration for sugarcane cutting or working in brick production. My maternal aunt, Pama Devi, is one of them. Pama Devi is 55 years old and has 3 children. Like most of the young generation of Dalits, all of the children have migrated to the cities in search of education and better livelihood. I did not want them to live in the village either, she says. They are better off in the cities where they can escape this caste system, though that is not necessarily the case. This village is less than 20 miles away from my hometown and easily accessible by public transport. When I visited my family in India in December 2017, I invited my aunt to come and visit me. She replied, I don't have any money to come. Since she had a fund disproportion, I did not take her seriously, as the bus would cost her only 50 cents, that is 35 rupees for a trip. I assumed that surely she had that much money to visit me. When she did not come that day, I called her again to complain, to which she responded, I told you I don't have any money to pay for the bus fare. Today, a Vanzari other backward caste woman, has called me to help me in washing her clothes. She is going to pay me for the work I shall be able to earn and come when I'm done with the work here. I I got hurt in my I got hurt in my leg and I'm not able to walk properly. So this thing, I always knew she was not economically self-sufficient, but did not realize that her situation had worsened. I was relaxed and sad at the same time. Usually in this month of December, the farmers in India are busy harvesting the second crop of the season, which provides ample livelihood opportunities for agricultural laborer like her. When I asked her the reason for her lack of money, she had an illustrating story for me. She told me that the rains have been irregular for the past few years and therefore the most of the farmers are unable to grow the second crop in the season. She also mentioned that due to the limited availability of agricultural work in the village, the farmers who are able to grow the second crop prefer to employ individuals from their own castes. As I knew that 100% non-Dalit families in her village owned lands, I inquired about the one who had to do agricultural labor instead. The ones non-Dalit with less land cannot grow a December crop due to irregular rains, so they are working as laborers for their harvest to earn money. Then they will prepare to grow crops on their lands in the next season. She said, "Do they not have any work for you? After all, you have worked for them for so many years." I asked her, how will they give us work when they have their own people available and need the work? She responded in a matter of fact way. Unfortunately, that the situation left her with no work as agriculture laborer. The employment preference, even in the agriculture sector field, depends on caste. Being landless, a woman and Dalit made her vulnerable, not only being able to secure any livelihood at all. Knowing her economic condition and that of other Dalit household in the village, I inquired about her livelihood options. She informed me that the younger generation of Dalits in the village have migrated to cities in search of livelihood. She herself had been migrating seasonally to work in big production in nearby villages for past couple of years. Now she was unable to do it because of impending health issues, she said. Last year, while working in big cleans, I got hurt in my leg. I'm not able to even walk properly and thus cannot travel for work. My son, who lives in Pune, a city 200 miles away, sends me money every month for grocery. And if I get lucky, I get paid once or twice a week for manual labor like washing clothes or cleaning house. As this was a situation which had not crept over overnight, I asked her about any other support from self-help groups or government agencies. Surely they must be thinking about these issues as well, as if this is the case of almost 20% of the population in the village. True, SHGs can provide us loans as low interest at low interest, but we have to pay back in weekly installments. Due to the uncertainty of finding a job at this age, I cannot take the risk of taking loans from them. They are also often caste based, thus they are of no use to me, she said. Although I'm getting subsidized food grains from the government schemes of below poverty line household, they are not enough to survive. I cannot work in National Rural Employment Guarantee scheme now because of my hurt leg and health issues, she explained. The NREGA is an employment scheme for the government of India, which aims to provide at least 100 days of guaranteed wages employment in a financial year to every household member who volunteers to do unskilled labor. She also told me that the non-Dalit women were able to borrow money from SHGs to invest in preparing their land for upcoming agriculture season and are paying back the loans in weekly installments from alternate modes of earning like selling livestock, poultry, and goats. I have neither land nor livestock. Who should I depend upon for returning the installments? If I were to take a loan from a CG, she mused. She also mentioned that a few non-Dalit families have brought autos and jeeps to use as taxis with support from financial institutions for mortgaging their lands. Out of curiosity, I asked her, why don't you ask for loans for the install from the institutions or banks to set up a small scale business? She said the bank loan process is very complicated. They ask for a lot of paperwork. I'm not educated. They do not know how to talk to me. Why would the bank give us loans? We don't have anything to mortgage. We don't have anyone there. These non-Dalit people give us loans and all because they have their people everywhere to support them. Her work kept reverberating to me, making me ponder about climate change effects in rural area, class and caste structures, and Dalits trapped in them. This illustration is a perfect example of the progression of multiple phenomena leading to economic inequities. It also demonstrates the role of climate change in contribution to widening the gap between haves and have-nots due to the intersection of caste and class. The case study explains the plight of a Dalit woman considered who is considered at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, facing the triple burden operation of caste, class, and gender with climate change, exacerbating the factors of operation. The landless, irregular livelihood options as well as discrimination in the labor market makes women like Pama Devi's situation a useful anecdote for many other millions of Dalit households of rural India. Further, the inability of the state to address the livelihood needs livelihood needs of disabled, illiteracy, and elderly Dalit landless women exposes the shortcoming of the state policies which are not holistic in nature. It also shows government officials lacking empathy towards the most marginalized at the intersection of caste, class, and gender, age, and disability. The state policy align with the caste system and influence the economic distribution, exacerbating economic inequities. Climate change constrains economic capability of various castes disproportionately. The impact of drought and flooding due to climate change in rural India impacts agriculture, which is largest sector of livelihood. While these changes affect everyone with dependence on agriculture, the impact of these climate changes are disproportionate. The dominant caste proposes possess land and other assets that they have accumulated through generations, which lower caste and the least do not have. The dominant caste can therefore mitigate climate change challenges by utilizing their resources like saving, bank credits, and insurance, or by selling their assets. They also have reliable social sector and social network and social capital to follow back upon in case of climate change risk. Although climate change affects them, it does not threaten their immediate existence. On the other hand, lack of resources and social power has embedded lower castes from building their capacity to manage change. They do not have any resources to use to adapt to the climate change and therefore tend to cut on their food, water, healthcare, nutrition, or education. Often they are forced to migrate or sell assets of which they depend for recovery. Climate change further pushes lower castes, especially Dalits, into involuntary unemployment, leading to hunger and poverty. In some, climate change adoption of communities depending on their assets and state and social capital within their network for support. Climate change have been affecting the agriculture sector for long time, which has caused the widening of economic inequities due to caste system. Caste with resources are less affected by climate change than those with lower or no resources like Dalits. Thus, differential capacity to adapt to climate change is affected by availability of assets which further reinforces social and economic inequity. The paper further examines climate justice from the Ambedkar feminist framework as a human rights issue, which is linked with caste system in India, exacerbating economic inequity. And finally, the research recommends several actions to address economic inequities based on caste in context of climate change. So now coming to the recommendations, um, when I'm reading out these challenges and these issues, um, how climate change or climate change is impacting disproportionately the caste system based on this case study. For more further analysis, you can read the paper which will be published within a couple of weeks, and I would surely share that link with everyone. So while recommending by using Ambedkarite feminist framework, the first solution which comes to this is state socialism, that is state controlled over the public resources, agriculture lands and industries, which would first break the disproportional holdings of these lands by certain population group and redistribute it with the landless or resourceless population in the society, which will provide them opportunity to mitigate or to sustain themselves in the challenging time to come in future, because climate change is unavoidable. Like for next 100 years, if we don't address climate change through our policies or through our actions, we are going to lag behind in saving our society or like addressing the challenges of our population. So this could be one of the um, better or like recommended solution to sustain or to take care of the population in longer future, and which would be sustainable. Second would be linking livelihood programs with environment sustainability. So the other challenge in Indian policies which have been brought into picture after literature review shows that the policies are not correlated or does not consider the other challenges or other programs and policies with each other. For example, um, um, rural development is never um, seen through the climate change or climate justice perspective, which would, if the rural development or for programs like rural development NRG would have considered migration due to climate change, they would have surely brought some more opportunities of livelihood at the village level, and which would have addressed the migration and disproportional impact on the groups in the villages or in rural areas. Other would be redistribution approach from building resilience and land uh, redistribution. When I'm saying land redistribution, it is agriculture and non-agriculture land. The non-agriculture land, which also is known as grazing land or any other land which could be used as livelihood uh, with livestock or with any other like fishery or any other thing, and which can be redistributed to the in the areas where the agriculture is not the primary source of livelihood for the population, which can be provided to the population so that they can sustain themselves with the livelihood, or and which also would impact the environment or the cycle of rainfall in that area, and which would sustain them in longer term, and which would also address the climate change at their level, not address, at mitigate, build their capability to face that challenge with these. Um, and when I'm saying this, everything, I have borrowed this only from the Constitution. And when I'm using Ambedkar framework, I say that um, he he has been advocate of human rights, and it reflects in every section and every article of Constitution and even the policies. And if you visit back to these recommendation policies, which he has embedded into uh, some of his work, which has been um, like seen through his social economic as environmentalist or as like everything, even he has spoken about mines and everything. This was one of the approach using his um, framework of state socialism. So my paper concludes by providing recommendations to address the climate change and bring climate justice, by using state socialism as solution. I think so. I'm done. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions and if you have any doubts, you can ask me. Thank you so much.
I think
Yes.
students who are members of the study circle, I think, will also be here. I also saw Beena Muniappa here. She's the daughter of one of my colleagues.
Yes,
Beena,
sir.
are you
She is
there?
there.
Okay.
Ah, sir, she is there.
Okay, okay, good, good. So there are some known faces also here. So thank you, Dr. Satish, for inviting me to speak on what I think is a very important contemporary topic, Dr. Ambedkar's environmental thought. I agreed when Dr. Satish asked me to speak. I immediately agreed because Dr. Ambedkar is a fascinating scholar, and to be able to explore his ideas is always a very interesting exercise, very rich exercise, because you get to understand a very eminent personality and intellectual much better when you try to engage with him through his ideas, through his writings. And therefore, I took it up as a challenge. Although, when Dr. Satish told me Ambedkar's environmental thought, my initial response was to say, I don't think I'm competent to speak about it. But then, when he told me that an expert from the US, Dr. Dada Sahib Tandale, is it? How do you pronounce the name? Tandale.
Yeah.
I hope I pronounced your name right, Dada Sahib.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I thought I'm the second speaker, so let me give the pride of place to an expert in the area. And I think he has done a good job, Dr. Dada Sahib, speaking about a very important paper that he has written, Caste, Economic Inequality, Climate Justice in India. And it's a very interesting paper, scholarly paper, of course. So one has to listen very carefully to the presentation to be able to understand how Dr. Dada Sahib has linked these terms, very important terms, climate justice with economic inequality, linking it up to caste, Dr. Ambedkar. And I liked what he said at the end of his presentation. State socialism is perhaps the solution to many of these problems. Dr. Dada Sahib didn't say this, but I think it's implied that somehow in independent India, we did not give Dr. Ambedkar the kind of place, the kind of role that the country should have. You all are familiar with the fact that when he was given the a particular portfolio, he was not happy with that because he felt something more important, something more in tune with nation building is something that he felt that he deserved. And therefore, I have this particular regret that some of leading India's intellectual giants, particularly of the stature of Dr. Ambedkar, were not utilized sufficiently well in the task of nation building that this country undertook. I'm not underestimating Nehru's role. Nehruvian socialism and so on did play a role. But the kind of state socialism that Dr. Ambedkar spoke about was, I think, quite different. And therefore, I think we missed a golden opportunity to incorporate Dr. Ambedkar's rich ideas. For example, the concept of state socialism that Dr. Dada Sahib referred to, I think would have played a very important role in doing development in a much more comprehensive, effective fashion throughout these 70, 75 years. I don't think farmers would be agitating if Dr. Ambedkar's concept of state socialism, his understanding of agrarian philosophy, his understanding of agriculture, the problems of agriculture and so on. I think we have missed a golden opportunity, and I think we are paying the price for it today. So with this little background, let me get down to business. The topic given to me is Ambedkar and environmental thought. And as I said initially, when Professor Satish spoke to me, I thought I will decline, but then I did it. I took it up as a challenge because, to be very honest, I have read Ambedkar, quite a few of his volumes in Dr. Ambedkar's writings and speeches I have gone through. Perhaps I've looked at it more from a political science perspective, more from a constitutional, Indian constitution perspective. I've written also articles on Ambedkar's concept of social justice, Ambedkar's role in the drafting of the Indian constitution, Ambedkar's understanding of democracy. I have spent quite some time engaging with Dr. Ambedkar and his concept of democracy. But this is new, so I'm making a confession right at the very beginning that I accepted the offer to speak, although I did not know sufficiently well or did not know enough about Ambedkar and environmental thought. But then I did some reading, and I'm happy that I have the confidence now to make a small presentation before you. I may not take as much time as the organizers have given me, but nonetheless, at least 10 to 15 minutes, I would like to share what I have learned about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and his environmental thought. So at the outset, let me state that Dr. Ambedkar's engagement with the environmental question has been relatively unexplored. Not too many scholars have attempted to understand Dr. Ambedkar's engagement with the environmental question. Most people have gone into a fair amount of depth in trying to understand the contribution of Ambedkar in the fields of constitutionalism. His contribution is richer, or economic thought, or law, politics, history, education, religion, and all these areas, state socialism, as Dr. Dada Sahib was telling us. Now, all these areas, Ambedkar has made immense contribution, huge contribution. But one area that has been neglected are his ideas on environmental thought, which is perhaps why the Ambedkar Study Circle of Seshadripuram Evening College thought it important to call some scholars and get them to share their thoughts on Dr. Ambedkar's thoughts on environmental issues. Not to say that Ambedkar has not explored or written or engaged with these areas, but what I'm saying is scholars who try to explore Ambedkar's ideas on environment has not been sufficient, not sufficiently well explored. The closest I would come is Ambedkar on water management. Studies done by Abraham, for example, or Dr. Thorat, for example. They have looked at water management very carefully. And then, of course, we have more recent studies on the subject. But then scholarly work, extensive scholarly work is missing when we try to engage with Dr. Ambedkar's environmental thought. But when one tries to look into Ambedkar's writings to find out what exactly is he telling us about the environment, I think, and I'm making the statement very responsibly, that the environmental thought of Ambedkar has indeed fascinating ecological dimensions. And I'm saying this because I've enjoyed researching to speak for 15 minutes or so on this particular platform. And the more I've tried to read about Ambedkar's environmental thought, the more I find it fascinating, because the ecological dimension, some of the aspects that Dr. Dada said referred to, are there in Ambedkar's thought, Ambedkar's environmental thought, and I find it fascinating. But the trouble is, if you want it all in one place, one book, you will not be able to find it. One will have to be persistent to be able to find what exactly Ambedkar is trying to tell us when he's talking about the environment, when he's talking about ecology. So effectively, what I'm saying is you have to look at Ambedkar's ideas on village, for example, Ambedkar's ideas on land, on agriculture, on water, on community, on industry, technology, science. And when you read up Ambedkar's views on all these areas, and let me repeat these areas: village, land, agriculture, water, community, industry, technology, science, you have, or you begin to understand that this intellectual has a good understanding of environmental issues, environmental questions. As I said earlier, you will not find it in one place. You will have to look for his ideas in each of these realms and be able to weave it together. That job is ours. Okay, the scholar's job, scholars like Dr. Dada Sahib, read up Ambedkar's ideas on all these aspects and be able to weave that together and say, okay, I think I have an understanding of Dr. Ambedkar's environmental thought. Okay, this is what I wanted to say right at the very beginning, and let me now proceed by putting by asking deep environmental questions that Dr. Ambedkar did not really ask himself directly, but which comes through when you're reading Ambedkar's writings in all these areas. Okay, now Ambedkar's posing deep environmental questions, and I am posing these questions before you. I have summarized these into 5 environmental questions that Dr. Ambedkar is asking. Okay, I'm putting myself in Dr. Ambedkar's shoes, and I'm saying these are Dr. Ambedkar's deep environmental questions. But again, I must apologize because you will not find these questions actually flowing from Dr. Ambedkar's pen, but they are very much there when you read Dr. Ambedkar's writings in the areas that I just mentioned. So I'm posing 5 deep environmental questions that Dr. Ambedkar poses, and I think they're very important in the present context, also continue to be relevant in the present context. And I'd like you to listen very carefully to these 5 questions. And how does Ambedkar attempt to answer these questions? I will take up 2 small case studies from the perspective of the village and from the perspective of the commons. 2 small case studies, and then try to tell you this is how Ambedkar would answer the questions that he raises himself. So this is question number 1. Ambedkar is asking, can environment be disentangled from caste injustices? That's question number 1 that Ambedkar is asking. Can you separate the environment from the injustices of caste? Question number 2, can the rural landscape be disengaged from social relations and from structures of power? That's the second question. When we look at rural India, we look at the rural landscape, can you disengage the rural landscape and all the people that it encompasses from the social relationships of each group with another, or to be more precise, of each caste with another? The social relations of caste, can you disengage the rural landscape from the social relations of caste and from the structures of power? Not only political power, but also socio-economic power. That's the question number 2 that Ambedkar poses, which is, I think, also an environmental question. How, you will know from my 2 illustrations. Question number 3, can one foreground the idea of community? When one looks at community, in Kannada we call it samudaya. Samudayada ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿದಾಗ, when you're looking at community, can you understand community without unpacking the power dynamics internal to a community? ಸಮುದಾಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಒಳಗಡೆ ಇರುವ ಈ ಅಧಿಕಾರದ ಈ ಶಕ್ತಿಯ ಡೈನಮಿಕ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳದೆ ನಾವು ಇದು ಸಮುದಾಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯವಿದೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ. ಇದು 3ನೇ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ, ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಎತ್ತಾ ಇರುವ 3ನೇ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ. ಸಮುದಾಯದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಆ ಸಮುದಾಯ ಒಳಗಡೆ ಇರುವ ಪವರ್ ಡೈನಮಿಕ್ಸ್ ನ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ದೆ ಇದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಸಮುದಾಯನೂ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗಲ್ಲ, ಸಮುದಾಯ ಪರಿಸರದಲ್ಲಿರೋ ಸಮುದಾಯನೂ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳಿಕ್ ಆಗಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ. ಇದು ದಿಸ್ ಥರ್ಡ್ ಕ್ವೆಶ್ಚನ್. ಸಾರಿ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ದಾದಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್, ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಥರ್ಡ್ ಕ್ವೆಶ್ಚನ್ that Dr. Ambedkar is raising. And the 4th question is related to democracy. Can transitions to democracy be understood without their ecological contexts? And democracy is a major value, major virtue, and Dr. Ambedkar's speeches on democracy are extensive. And please remember that famous speech of Dr. Ambedkar, among the great speeches of the last century. One of my favorites is Dr. Ambedkar's speech of 25th November 1949, the last speech in the Constituent Assembly of India, 25th November 1949, which is sometimes called the Grammar of Anarchy speech, where he's talking about we are now bringing in political democracy into the country. But what meaning does political democracy have if that political democracy is not accompanied by social and economic democracy? So that's the transition to democracy Ambedkar speaks about in that last speech. But elsewhere, Dr. Ambedkar is asking this question, can transitions to democracy be understood without their ecological contexts? We are transiting from a colony to a democracy. And we're undertaking transitions. In the speech, Ambedkar is talking about social and economic democracy in addition to accompany political democracy. So whatever transition democracy one is talking about, can you understand these transitions without their ecological contexts? That's question number 4, I think Ambedkar is asking us. And then question number 5, which I think is perhaps the most important, can modernity happen? ಆಧುನೀಕರಣ ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಓದಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ, 75 ವರ್ಷ ಆಯ್ತು, ಆಗಿದೆಯೋ ಇಲ್ವೋ ಅಂತ ಇನ್ನೂ ಕೇಳ್ತಾನೆ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ. Can modernity happen when Dalits are outside the ecological spaces and intellectual universes as defined by the upper castes? This, I think, is perhaps the most important question. So I'm posing 5 questions that Ambedkar poses, not directly in the language that he has used, but by trying to understand what Ambedkar is telling us. I'm stating that if you're looking for an understanding of Dr. Ambedkar's environmental thought, I think we should begin our discussion by looking at these 5 deep environmental questions that Ambedkar is posing. Question number 1, can environment be disentangled from caste injustices? Question number 2, can the rural landscape be disengaged from social relations and structures of power? Question number 3, can one understand community without understanding the power dynamics inherent in communities? Question number 4, can transitions to democracy be understood without their ecological context? And question number 5, can modernity happen? Can development happen? Can modernization happen? Can growth happen when Dalits are outside the ecological spaces and the intellectual universes as defined by the upper castes? Now, obviously, we have to look for answers to these questions. And I will again take the help of Ambedkar's writings as far as 2 areas are concerned. One, as far as the village is concerned, and secondly, as far as the commons is concerned. In fact, Dr. Dada Sahib would, understand this term commons much better than all of us, perhaps, because in environmental science, the word commons, the word common property resources is used so very frequently. So I'm just using 2 small examples, Ambedkar's perception of the village, Ambedkar's perception of the commons, to be able to find answers to those 5 questions that I've just posed a little while ago. Take a look at the village and how the village has been romanticized by so many people in India, especially if you're looking at the 3 great ideologues, leaders of the freedom movement, Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar. You find Gandhi romanticizing the village, you find Nehru romanticizing the village. It's only Ambedkar among these 3 ideologues, among these 3 leaders of the freedom movement, was the only one who had first-hand experience of village life. As a Dalit child, trying to get educated in a village, and experiencing all the pains and pangs of untouchability. Now that was Ambedkar who knew what a village actually was. So when Gandhi speaks of Gram Swaraj, Village Swaraj, and Nehru speaks about something similar, that you can do rural development through community development schemes, programs, and so on, did they have a real understanding of the village where Ambedkar grew in? And how the village presented itself as a model of a Hindu social organization. In Baba Sahib Ambedkar writings and speeches, I think it's volume 5, Ambedkar says this: controlling habitations, controlling natural resources, controlling the economy of a village is seen as central not only to the continuity of the Hindu social order, but also to its political and economic standing. Now, that's the Hindu social organization, and Ambedkar says this in one of his volumes, that the village is the factory of the Hindu social order. That's where the caste system is most rampant, and therefore, when he says the village is a microcosm of the Hindu social order, you can see the caste system operating in full swing. So when Ambedkar is talking of the village, when the village republic is a term that has been used, Ambedkar says the village is a negation of the republic. How can you call the village a republic? How can you speak of liberty, equality, fraternity in the context of a village? When the village is a republic of the touchables, when the village is an empire of touchable Hindus, which leaves the untouchables outside the village republic, how can you call it a village republic? That was the basic question Ambedkar is asking. Yes, so against this background, I think it's important for us to note that not only Dr. Ambedkar, but many other anti-caste thinkers, activists like Periyar, Jyotiba Phule, and so on, are raising in the context of the village and all that the village represents, these great minds, anti-caste thinkers, are raising fundamental issues of human rights, of right to access resources, environmental rights, right to livelihood, right to ecology, and so on and so forth. That's my little case study about the village and how Ambedkar, from a bottom-up perspective, from a first-hand perspective, is able to tell us that you cannot call the village a republic because of the casteism that is rampant in a village. If I had time, I'd have gone into Ambedkar's response in the Constituent Assembly of India. If you read the debates, Article 40 in the Constitution of India was an afterthought. It was not there that there should be Panchayat Raj and local government and all that. And when people ask, somebody asked Dr. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly of India, how is it that in the land of Gandhi, there's no mention of Panchayat Raj or local self-government, rural local government in the Constitution of India? And Ambedkar gives a reply. What village are you talking about? What does a village represent? And those harsh words that he uses against the village. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the words that Ambedkar used in that particular context. And that's one about the village. I also like to look at the commons, the understanding of commons in contemporary environmental science literature. In contemporary ecological jargon, the word commons is so very important. In environmental science would probably call it common property resources, and Dr. Dada Sahib would be well aware of what I'm talking about here. In a rural context, what do we mean by common property resources? We are talking about common land, we're talking about fishing areas, we're talking about cremation sites, burial grounds, grazing land. Now, all of these all over the world are identified as commons, or identified as common property resources. And what does the idea of common property resources mean? What does commons mean? The right of everyone to access and utilize what it contains. So the commons gives the idea, gives the impression, should give the impression that it's a collective, that is inclusive, that is supportive. But then if a Dalit were to come to a commons and say, I want to graze my cattle here, or I want to fish in this pond, or I want to use the common land for some purpose, Dalits do not have access to common property resources, and this we know historically has happened for thousands of years. So when we use the word common property resources, how do Dalits look upon these commons? They immediately visualize the word commons or common property resources as embodiments of caste segregation, which reminds them very harshly of exclusion, of pain, of suffering, of beatings. How dare you come and ask to use the commons? Whom did you ask before you brought your cattle for grazing here? How dare you walk upon the commons? How dare you try to take water from a pond? I suppose you understand what one is talking about here. So when Ambedkar is responding to all that is happening in rural India, Ambedkar is actually speaking a certain kind of a language, is expressing a certain kind of a philosophy, which I am saying is eco-social philosophy. And what is at the core of Ambedkar's eco-social philosophy? The premise: the resources of nature are meant for everybody. Resources of nature are not meant only for a few, upper caste, or for the touchable communities. Resources are meant for everybody. Resources of common resource are meant for all. And all human beings possess equal right to use these resources of nature because these are natural resources. These are available in nature. And this brings me to water, a huge area of conflict, especially in those days. Water, such a deeply contentious area on the basis of caste, on the basis of gender, on the basis of class. Water as a source of power. Who owns water? The pattern of water distribution, location of water resources, and see how much of power this common property resource actually has. And look how we have treated water in our country. Issues such as accepting water only from certain castes, not from others, long journeys to reach water, denial of clean water, thirst. Now, all of things are so dominant in Dalit narratives and autobiographies. And Ambedkar's writings, I think, are rich in pointing out the ignominy of denying water to a so-called untouchable. And some of you may recall the Mahad Satyagraha, the burning of the Manusmriti, are all, I think, emblematic of Dalit and Ambedkar's struggles just over water. And over water, the struggle over water is to be seen as the foundational struggle of the entire Dalit movement for caste annihilation, which very dramatically Ambedkar dramatizes through the Mahad Satyagraha and the picking up some water from a common village tank. Okay, so with these two case studies, small case studies, of course, or illustrations, if I may correctly put it, because when I say case study, Dr. Dada Sahib, who's the scholar here, will say case studies should have this format and all that. So I will not call case study. I'll say two simple, small illustrations, not small, they are big. For a Dalit, these are big illustrations. One, the village, and two, common property resources. Just with these two illustrations, I will now try to answer those same 5 questions that Ambedkar asked a little while ago. And these, I think, would be his 5 answers. The environment cannot be disentangled from caste injustices. When you're trying to understand environment, parisarana vishleshane ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಜಾತಿದು ಅನ್ಯಾಯವನ್ನ ಪರಿಸರದಿಂದ ತೆಗೆದಾಕಿ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯವಿದೆಯಾ? And Ambedkar's answer, you cannot understand environment by disentangling it from caste injustices. Number 2, the rural landscape cannot be disengaged from social relations and structures of power. Number 3, one cannot understand community without understanding the power dynamics inherent in communities. Upper castes, transitions to democracy cannot be understood without their ecological context. If you want to transit to a true democracy, a substantive democracy, not just a procedural democracy, a socio-economic democracy, not just a political democracy, Dr. Ambedkar told us, again, you cannot understand the transition to democracy without understanding their ecological context. And last but not the least, modernity, development, growth cannot happen when a huge body of people are excluded from ecological spaces and intellectual universes which are defined and delimited by the upper castes. When you're leaving large sections of the people outside ecological spaces and then to intellectual universes, who defines these as defined by the upper caste? Can you talk of development? Can you talk of modernity? And can you talk of even sustainable development? That's the essence of my presentation. I have something to say about Neo-Buddhism, Ambedkar, and so on. I think I'll quickly run through this part of my framework. The second part of my framework, I've titled Neo-Buddhism, Ambedkar, and Egalitarian Environmentalism. So in order to find answers to these questions, we made Ambedkar pose 5 questions. Ambedkar answers those 5 questions by saying that you have to bring in, bring the Dalit into, bring the marginalized, bring the subaltern into the ecological understanding, into the environment, into ecological spaces. Effectively, what Ambedkar is pleading for is something called egalitarian environmentalism. That's the kind of environmentalism that I think this country requires. Again, you won't find these words in Ambedkar's literature, but Ambedkar is saying we need egalitarian environmentalism. And to develop this concept, we find Ambedkar taking the help of Gautam Buddha, and the ism which is called Neo Buddhism, I think gives us quite a lot of inspiration, ideas to be able to understand this term called egalitarian environmentalism. Because if you understand Buddha's vision of nature, of the world, all species are interconnected, all living forms are mutually dependent upon each other. Dr. Dada Sahib will know when I use the term the Gaia hypothesis, or about the food chain. You know how the web of life, all species are intricately interconnected to each other, although we may not, directly, be connected to each other. So this is Buddha's vision of nature, a very intricate eco-biological concept, which Dr. Ambedkar was able to understand, to be able to come up with his concepts of either socio-ecological egalitarianism or even inclusive environmentalism. I'll just quote Ambedkar here, which one of the quotations which I think you should listen to very carefully. Ambedkar is invoking Buddha when he's making the statement. What is love? Love is not enough. What is required is Maitri. Ambedkar, invoking Buddha, is making a distinction between love and between Maitri. Maitri, he's saying, is wider than love. It means fellowship, not merely with human beings, but with all living beings. Is not such a Maitri necessary, asked Dr. Ambedkar. What else can give to all living beings the same happiness which one seeks for oneself? I'm quoting Dr. Ambedkar here. So love is not enough. What is required is Maitri, and Maitri is not merely fellowship with fellow human beings, it's fellowship with all living beings. That's the loving, that's the kindness, that's the compassion towards all living forms. That is an essential feature of Buddhism, one of the important ecological virtues of Buddhism that Ambedkar imbibes, and says, I think it's important that we look at the environment and all the creatures within the environment from this particular perspective. So I find in Ambedkar's environmental thought rich ideas and concepts. You may not find this terminology, these concepts when you read Ambedkar, but Ambedkar is effectively pleading for the creation of an ecological democracy with ecological justice. Apart from what he spoke about in his famous speech of 25th November 1949, when he said, what use is political democracy without social and economic democracy? Okay, Ambedkar did not openly express it then, but Ambedkar elsewhere is speaking about the need for another prefix to be added to democracy, and that prefix is ecological democracy. Of what use is political democracy, if I may again take liberties with Ambedkar's speech, of what use is political democracy without ecological democracy, without ecological justice? I've written on Ambedkar's social justice fairly extensively, but here is Ambedkar telling us about ecological justice. Ambedkar is talking to us about socio-ecological egalitarianism. He's speaking about environmental egalitarianism. He's talking about inclusive environmentalism. Now, all these terms, I think, come to us from Ambedkar, and in the Indian context, I think they need to be taken very seriously in our understanding of the environment today. So finally, I think in 2 minutes, I'll be completing. By way of concluding observations, I wish to make a few, or I'll put it differently. Here are my concluding observations. Ambedkar's ideas offer a refreshingly, what shall I say, hidden perspective to environmentalism. They offer a radical perspective to Indian environmentalism. His ideas on environment show that environment needs to be located in the dynamics of social forces that ultimately determine the nature of human relationship with the environment. Ambedkar's ideas remind us that environmental governance should be crafted based upon the principle of equity and justice, environmental justice, to cater to the needs of all sections of society. Ambedkar's ideas enable us to engage with issues of ecological democracy, which include inclusive environmentalism, or if you want to put it, environmental egalitarianism. Ambedkar's engagement with Buddhism proposes a biocentric approach to look at social processes. What does this mean? Not only that all species, including human beings, have equal rights over nature, at the same time that all human beings have the responsibility to preserve nature, to protect nature. And therefore, I think, and this is my last statement, Ambedkar's contribution to ecology needs to be furthered to be able to usher in a just, ecologically embedded society in India. So Ambedkar's thoughts on environmental thoughts are exceedingly rich. One needs to read up a lot of Ambedkar's ideas on other aspects to be able to appreciate, to be able to understand what Ambedkar spoke about. And I think the next step is to look at the Ambedkar's model of development. And on this, I think Dr. Dada Sib has also spoken about the kind of state socialism that is required, but that is a different story, and perhaps one can look at that on another occasion. I hope I've kept to my time, or have I exceeded it. I'm sorry if I've crossed my time, but I'm through. And let me thank once again Satish for inviting me. Once again, the chairman, Shri W.D. Ashok, and all the listeners here for giving me a patient listening. Back to hand over the microphone back to the organizers. Thank you very much.